If you enjoyed watching the Queen's Gambit on Netflix, then you're in the right place, because in this video, we'll explore the Queen's Gambit opening in depth so you can improve your game and hopefully become a chess master like Beth Harmon. So let's dive in. The Queen's Gambit starts off with the move pawn to d4. As you guys can see from the opening itself, the opening name is Queen's Gambit, so queen pawn, so we move up our queen pawn first. Black will respond with pawn to d5, and now here comes the move pawn to c4. As the opening name suggests, this is a gambit because our pawn on c4 is not protected by any piece, and black can capture our pawn at this instance. Gambits are usually played in the opening, where you sacrifice a pawn to gain some sort of advantage, usually which would be a lead in development, because here if black captures our pawn, now black's d5 pawn is no longer there, which controls the e4 square. So white can easily play a move like pawn to e4, and white can also recapture back the pawn on c4 with the bishop. And since white no longer has the d pawn, now white has the two center pawns e4 and d4, which is what white is looking for in this Queen's Gambit. So for today's video, we'll be discussing two main variations in the Queen's Gambit. Number one, which is the accepted Queen's Gambit accepted variation, and number two, if black does not accept the gambit but plays the Queen's Gambit Declined. So black does not capture the pawn and plays another move instead, which is why it would be a Queen's Gambit Declined. So let's start off with the Queen's Gambit accepted. Here white has several options. You can play pawn to e4 as mentioned earlier, you can play knight to f3, knight to c3, or pawn to e3. And for today's video, we'll be going to recommend this move pawn to e3, and you might be wondering why move the pawn one square ahead instead of two squares where we can control the center, and the reason will be justified in the next few moves. So now if black tries to hold on to this pawn by playing a move like pawn to b5, black is unable to do so because now we play the move pawn to a4, undermining the b5 pawn. Black can try to protect the b5 pawn with either a6 or c6, but both of the pawn moves loses, because if pawn to a6, you can just capture this pawn on b5, and black will not be able to recapture because of the pin on the a file on the black rook. So for most of you who are beginners or intermediate level, don't be surprised because this variation might appear in some of your games if your opponent does not know the opening theory. It might be easy to see that pawn to a6 is unplayable because of captures, which is why your opponent might play the other move pawn to c6. However, pawn to c6 is a blunder as well, because now after captures, black cannot capture back due to the fact that you can play queen to f3, trapping the rook on a8, and there is no way for black to defend this rook. And now we can see the whole idea why we push up our pawn to e3 instead of playing pawn to e4 on move number 3 earlier on, because if our pawn were to be on e4, we would no longer have this diagonal with our queen trapping the rook on a8. And if in this position black captures our a4 pawn, now we just have to capture back the c4 pawn with our bishop, and we have the same threat of queen f3 coming soon, trapping the rook and also threatening to give check and checkmate soon on f7. So this is the reason why we are recommending you to play the move pawn to e3. Alright, so now let's take a look at what if black knows the opening theory and he doesn't try to play pawn to b5 to protect the c4 pawn. Instead, he plays a move like knight to f6, a normal developing move. So here we just recapture the pawn on c4, and now from black's perspective, he has to develop this dark square bishop, and he has two ways of doing so, either to play e6 or to play g6 to bring out his bishop both ways. The problem with playing pawn to e6 is the pawn blocks his own light square bishop from developing to f5 or to g4 later on. Of course, black can still develop like this, b6 and bishop b7, but that's not a normal route that you would play, as you would like to develop your bishop more naturally with either bishop to f5 or bishop to g4. So your opponent might play pawn to g6 and try to develop the bishop like this, fianchetting the bishop and castling on the next move. Surprisingly enough, the best move is actually to play pawn to e6, blocking your own bishop as black, and we'll see what's the reason why e6 is better than g6 later on. So if your opponent plays pawn to e6, don't worry because we just develop normally, play normal chess, and bring out our pieces. And now, since the pawn on e6 blocks the bishop, so black has to try to develop this way with b6 and bishop to b7. And now after we play queen to e2, we now support our pawn push on e4, and we are going to push up our pawn after bishop b7, e4, and white's position is just way better because now we have both our center pawns. Our pawn on e4 blocks the diagonal of the black's bishop, and it also frees up our own bishop to play either to f4, g5, or to e3 as well. And this just showcases the power of both the center pawns, as that's the main idea in the Queen's Gambit if black captured our c4 pawn from the start. So now let's take a look at what if black tries to develop this way instead, with g6. Again, we bring out our knight, and after bishop g7, we play this nice check move with queen to a4. Remember this queen to a4 check because it's a very important and key move. Now, black has 5 logical ways that he can respond against this check. He can play pawn to c6, he can block with knight to c6, knight to d7, or he can block with the bishop or with the queen. We do not consider knight f to d7 because that just undevelops his knight, and this knight will be blocking his own knight and bishop as well. Also, king to f8 avoids the check as well, but it is also illogical because now black cannot castle. So now let's take a look at the first move, which is knight to c6, blocking the check. Now we just play knight to e5, and our knight is hitting the knight on c6 and also threatening to capture on f7. And after castle captures, pawn captures, queen captures, we're just one pawn up as white. Similarly, if black defends with the bishop, now we just play queen to b3, and we have another double attack on the pawn on f7 and the pawn on b7, and we'll be easily one pawn up again. So now let's take a look at 2 other options that brings us tactical chances, which are knight to d7. Now here we have a nice tactical blow with bishop takes f7 check. The whole idea of this sacrifice is after king captures, we play knight to g5 check. The king has 3 moves to go, and if he plays either king to f8 or king to e8, we go knight to e6, trapping the queen on d8. So if black tries to go king to g8 this way instead, we play either queen to b3 check or queen to c4 check, and there's no stopping the checkmate on f7 later on. And if white blocks with the queen, queen to d7, now we have the same tactical sacrifice with bishop takes f7 check. If king captures, we just go knight to e5, check, and fork the queen. So the only way that black can defend this check without losing material is by playing pawn to c6. But before we continue our discussion on the Queen's Gambit, I want to remind you that your support means the world to us. If you're finding this video helpful and want to see more chess content like this, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support is what keeps us going and allows us to continue creating high quality chess content for you. So let's take a look at the move pawn to c6. Even though we do not gain any material advantage in this variation, but the pawn to c6 actually blocks his own knight from developing to c6 later. So now we play the move queen to b3, attacking the pawn on f7 and also getting away from the potential fork of pawn to b5 that black might play on the next move. So queen to b3, black will probably castle, we castle as well, and here it's not easy for black to find a move because our queen also keeps an eye on the b7 pawn, because if the bishop moves anywhere on the board, the b7 pawn would be under attack. So black can try to play a move like pawn to b5, pushing up his pawn to attack our bishop and also getting rid of his b7 pawn weakness, freeing up his own bishop. But here we just have to move our bishop back, and now as you guys can see, the c6 and b5 pawn moves will actually come back to haunt black later on in the game because black voluntarily push up his pawns to create weaknesses and targets for white, because now all we have to do is just finish development. We can play knight c3, bishop d2, rook to c1 and take full control of the c file and attack this weak c6 pawn. We can also play pawn to e4 and bring out our bishop even more to f4 or to g5. And this position is really easy for white to play. Alright, so we have discussed the Queen's Gambit Declined. The Queen's Gambit accepted, and now we are going to discuss what if black does not accept the gambit and play the Queen's Gambit Declined variation instead, which is pawn to e6. Of course, black has many other moves in this variation. For example, pawn to c6, which would be the Slav defense, can play knight to f6 as well, and other moves. But for this video, we'll be only discussing the Queen's Gambit Declined and the Queen's Gambit accepted. So let's take a look at what if black plays pawn to e6. Now we play knight to c3, developing our knight and putting pressure on the d5 pawn. Black will probably respond with knight to f6, developing a piece and also defending the d5 pawn as well. Now we have a few moves as white. We can play knight to f3, we can play bishop to f4, pawn to e3, or even bishop to g5. And here we're going to recommend the move bishop to g5 because it's just the simplest attacking move. We gain this pin on the knight to the queen and putting further pressure on the d5 pawn. A key thing to note here is that we want to bring our bishop out to either f4 or g5 first before playing the move pawn to e3, because by playing the move pawn to e3, we would be blocking our own bishop instead. So after bishop to g5, black would probably play bishop to e7, defending himself against the pin. We continue with our development with knight to f3, and after castles, now here we have another key move as white, which would be queen to c2. This is not a common main line and is actually a sub-variation, but the idea of this queen c2 is actually very powerful, because now if black tries to play pawn to h6, trying to kick away our bishop, we have this brilliant bishop sacrifice with pawn to h4. The whole idea of pawn to h4 is we are inviting black to capture our bishop instead, because after captures, now we free up the h file for our rook, and because we played queen to c2 earlier on, we are going to play queen to h7, giving checkmate if the knight on f6 moves away. So if black does not move the knight away, we can just capture it on the next move and regain our material while maintaining this h file advantage and queen to h7 checkmate threats. So black can try to play knight to e4, blocking our queen's diagonal to h7, but we just have to capture the knight, and after pawn takes, queen takes, the same threats are coming, queen to h7 checkmate. If black tries to play a move like pawn to g6, trying to block the diagonal, now we just swing our queen across to h4, and there's no defense against queen h7, queen h8 or queen h7 checkmate. Black can try to give a check with bishop to b4, but we just have to move our king to the side, and there's no defense to stop the checkmate. Black cannot play queen takes d4 check because our knight is protecting our d4 pawn. So now let's take a look at what if black plays pawn to h6 first before castling, because maybe they might have seen the move queen c2 followed by h4 with this tremendous attack, and they are worried for their king's safety. So now here we have two options. We can either capture the knight or we can bring the bishop back to h4. Both options are equally okay, and it depends on whether you want to keep your bishop pair or not. And for this video, we'll be discussing the lines with bishop takes f6. So after bishop captures, pawn to e3, castle. Now another key move to remember is we play this move rook to c1. The whole idea we play rook to c1 and not capturing the pawn on d5 or developing our bishop to e2 or d3 is because if we play bishop to d3, now black can just capture our c4 pawn, and we lose a tempo because we move our bishop again to recapture, compared to if we play our rook to c1 first. If black captures our c4 pawn now, we can just recapture with our bishop in one move, so we save a move. Also, by playing the move rook to c1, we are now asking black question. What is black going to do in this position? The e6 pawn blocks his own bishop from developing to f5 or g4, so if he would want to bring out his own bishop, he would have to play pawn to b6 and bishop to b7. Black would probably not capture our pawn because that would just help us develop our own bishop. So let's say he plays pawn to b6, and now only we capture the d5 pawn. The reason why we wait for pawn to b6 before capturing this d5 pawn is because now after pawn captures, we allow the bishop to develop to f5 or to g4, but since black already played the move pawn to b6 earlier on, pawn to b6 would just be a weakening move in the black's position, because for example, if black were to play knight to c6 on the next move, the knight on c6 will not be defended, as if we move our knight on c3, our rook will attack the knight. So now black is in a difficult spot because he wants to develop the bishop to f5 or to g4, but since he has committed to the move b6, he might as well play bishop b7 to develop the bishop, and also knight c6 after, with the knight being supported by the bishop. So here after bishop to d3, if black plays bishop to b7, now the d5 pawn blocks his own diagonal bishop. And as mentioned earlier, if he plays a move like bishop to g4, the move pawn to b6 was a weakening move previously, and he would be unable to play knight to c6 because that will lead to some complications and attacks. So either way black develops his bishop, it doesn't matter to us because now white has a really comfortable position. The black's bishop is not really doing anything. The black bishop on f6 also is not really doing anything. And even though black has the bishop pair, since we gave up our own bishop earlier on, we are still in a much better position. And we can just play normal moves like castling, and then we can look to play a move like queen to b3, putting extra pressure on the d5 pawn, or even playing knight to b5, trying to attack the pawn on c7. And of course, in the position earlier on, you can retreat your bishop to h4 instead if you want to keep your double bishop, and the position might continue with something like that. So same ideas for white. We want to use the c file later on, finish our development, castle, and our bishop might also be able to swing back to g3 and put extra pressure on the c7 pawn. And last but not least, I have to show you guys a really sneaky line in this position where black does not play bishop e7, but instead he plays knight b to d7. At first glance, this might seem like a blunder because white can just capture the d5 pawn. After capture, we can utilize this pin on the queen to gain a pawn with knight takes d5. However, this is the whole point of black's trap with the move knight to d7. Black is inviting us to capture this pawn because now he can play knight takes d5, giving up his own queen, and after bishop takes, he has this nice move with bishop to b4 check. The whole idea being our king has no moves, and the only way to stop check is by giving up our own queen instead with queen to d2. And after captures with captures, black can just recapture our bishop on d8 and black would be up a piece instead. So be careful and watch out for this knight to d7 move if your opponent plays this sneaky move. So instead of falling to the trap of capturing on d5, we just have to play the same moves that we did in other variations and develop our own pieces. So knight to f3, and now let's say bishop e7, pawn to e3, castle, queen to c2, again the key move, trying to aim at this pawn on h7. If black plays a move like pawn to h6, we have the similar idea to play pawn to h4, and if he after captures, the position will most likely be more or less the same, where we have attacking threats with queen to h7 checkmate. And that's all for today's video. We hope this video has inspired you to try out the Queen's Gambit and play like Beth Harmon. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more chess content. In the comments below, let us know which opening you prefer to play, the Queen's Gambit Accepted or the Queen's Gambit Declined. Thanks for watching, and we see you in the next video.